Gladiators have a reputation for being bloodthirsty, but what they truly thirsted for wasn't blood at all. It was beans? The gladiator industry was, to some degree, an equal opportunity profession. While most gladiators were enslaved people, criminals, or prisoners of war, they might find themselves training with and fighting nobility, free people, and both women and men from all strata of society. Sometimes free and once wealthy Romans signed up to become gladiators when they faced financial challenges. For example, according to Michael Grant's Gladiators, one descendant of an aristocratic clan found himself in such circumstances that he resorted to a gladiatorial career. For other free people, the associated glory of armed combat before an enthusiastic and bloodthirsty crowd was the appeal. The most prominent example of upper-class, thrill-seeking Romans going gladiatorial is the insane and sadistic Emperor Commodus, who thought he was a reincarnation of Hercules. Commodus, who has been featured in several films, including the Best Picture winner Gladiator, actively fought in the arena, although the outcome of Commodus's matches was effectively determined in advance, with him as the victor. For centuries, gladiatorial fighting was not gender-exclusive either. Until AD 200, when the emperor outlawed the practice, women fought as gladiators. Although the vast majority of gladiators were men, female contestants were a niche that had its appeal in some quarters. Some of these female gladiators came from aristocratic stock, though it's unclear why they signed up for the blood sport. But for these women gladiators, like the men, the spectacle was still central, and they took on mythological stage names like Amazon, just like the stars of American Gladiators did 2,000 years later.
This is Zap, strong, silent, the Terminator.
I don't care how tough they are, how big they are. I want to take them out, zap my ring.
Gladiators were not just given a sword or trident and told to start hacking and stabbing. Instead, gladiators were subject to years of intense training for what may amount to only one public bout. Rachel Hannell, in her book Gladiators, explains that this is because as the games grew in popularity, it was increasingly evident how valuable well-trained gladiators were as a commodity. As the institution developed and popularity grew, the length of training a single gladiator might undergo grew to as many as 3 years of formal training, before their first and perhaps last appearance in the arena. Trainees started with wooden weapons, hitting practice dummies or bales of hay. Eventually, trainees graduated to blunted metal weapons, which were heavier than the weapons to be used in the arena. These lessons were directed by a trainer or manager called a lanista, often a former gladiator himself, and multiple professional instructors would often teach specialized techniques. The training process was highly organized and complex, and widely respected in Roman society. The end result was a contest more akin to modern-day fencing, with precise movements that at least some spectators would be able to recognize and appreciate. Much of gladiator training was also mental. The lanista emphasized how special they were and how they were entering the ranks of an elite profession. And if the trainees lacked enthusiasm, harsh punishments were applied to break their will. Many gladiators lived in cells within communal barracks, where the only people whom they could associate with on equal terms were their fellow gladiators. And even then, there was a natural tension, since your colleagues could become your eventual killers. However, the Oxford Handbook of Sport and Spectacle in the Ancient World points out that these fighters seemed to be able to separate their friendships from the bloody business in the arena. Gladiators formed clubs, guilds, and friendship networks, with veteran gladiators and newcomers occupying separate ranks. Some gladiators went so far as to have families. The book Gladiators at Pompeii describes how one gladiator was married for 7 years before dying in the arena at age 22 after a career of 13 fights. Gladiators would typically live in communal barracks called schools, housed with a lively mix of enslaved or indentured fighters. While some of these were privately owned, many were built and overseen by the emperors. Conditions were often harsh, with it not uncommon for gladiators to be kept in chains, and the cramped conditions, as well as the constant combat training the fighters were expected to do, created a tinderbox of violence. Italy's Pompeii, famous for being buried under volcanic ash, has a particularly well-preserved building generally accepted to be a gladiator training school, and the gladiators' accommodations were basic, to say the least. Almost 100 windowless cells crammed into 2 floors, measuring barely 10 feet by 13 feet. If this sounds much like a prison, consider this. The school also had a prison, with ceilings so low that prisoners would have been unable to stand, and evidence that prisoners were chained by the legs. Not all gladiator schools were so grim, though. The communal housing in many schools was divided into halls, where a gladiator would reside with some others of the same or similar reputation. Imprisonment wasn't always a given either, and in some cases, schools were much like non-military schools or academies in modern times, where the gladiators were free to leave and return as they wished. And the finest gladiators were sometimes given training in private houses by high-ranking Roman military professionals or other martial experts. There were many gladiator schools throughout the empire, and the emperors even established their own. The schools were typically well organized with accommodation for gladiators and staff, gymnasiums, and practice arenas. Not all were just general-purpose gladiatorial factories either. One emperor constructed several schools that specialized in different styles of combat, including the Morning School, which pitted gladiators against wild animals. According to Anne Lean in All Things Ancient Rome, the lanista served as the principal intermediary between the gladiator school and the elite who wanted to put on spectacles. He was a dealer in flesh and could sell, buy, or rent gladiators. In fact, the term lanista is derived from the Latin term for butcher. It was a lucrative but socially demeaning job. The financial motivations being what they were, the lanista was motivated to keep his gladiators in the best possible shape. This way, he could fetch the best prices, and some of the best gladiators sold for so much that the emperor eventually put a price cap on them. Perhaps surprisingly, gladiators ate a diet that would make a vegan proud. A study published in PLOS One reported on archaeological excavations at a gladiator graveyard where a study of 22 gladiator remains revealed that the main staple diet of these ferocious warriors was barley and wheat. For protein, the gladiators consumed beans. Moreover, they chugged down a tonic containing plant ash as the ancient energy drink to further fortify them. This diet of barley and beans is confirmed in ancient writings. The ancient physician Galen, for example, reported that gladiators ate primarily a bean and barley porridge. Because of this, gladiators were called barley eaters or barley men. The result of this high-carb diet was gladiators with a high ratio of fat to body mass, and this conveyed a surprising advantage in their hazardous day job. Archaeology contends that a healthy layer of subcutaneous fat helped protect gladiators by providing layers over blood vessels and nerves, so a skinny gladiator may have been more likely to have their life quite literally cut short. Despite the wild popularity of gladiatorial bouts, gladiatorial work as an occupation was viewed by most Roman citizens as disgraceful. There were a couple of reasons for the denigration of the profession, which is explained in the Oxford Encyclopedia of Ancient Greece and Rome. First, gladiators on the whole came from disrespected elements of society, mainly enslaved persons or prisoners. Second, even if free people sold themselves to a lanista and became gladiators, it was a mark of disgrace, since the person was probably a financial basket case. In both cases, the gladiator no longer had control over their bodies and had no self-sovereignty. This is described by M.C. Bishop in Gladiators, who points out that gladiators took an oath which, when reconstructed, essentially reads,
"I swear to be burned, beaten, or die by the sword."
In taking the oath, a gladiator, enslaved or not, had been dehumanized. Nevertheless, a gladiator's notoriety did not always get in the way of achieving celebrity status, and some, like celebrities today, found their names in depictions celebrated in poetry and pottery alike. But even an A-lister gladiator would find their status subject to certain restrictions, such as being unable to enter the highest political ranks, and even if they had been freed from the enslavement, they could not become a Roman citizen. Gladiator bouts were no doubt exciting to watch, but they weren't especially long, so there were plenty of them, and the lead-up took up the rest of the slack. While gladiator games evolved over their long history, during imperial times the events were a full-day spectacle, with the gladiators proceeding through the amphitheater before presenting themselves to the emperor if he was present. Criminals who were condemned to death would state, "Hail Emperor, we who are about to die salute you." Before the main bouts, there were exhibition duels, sometimes with wooden weapons, all to get the crowd excited. After this warm-up act, a trumpet blew. This was the signal of official games and was joined by a cacophony of a roaring crowd and music. The gladiators entered the arena, and those who were reluctant were forced out with hot irons and whips. The matches themselves lasted 15 minutes or less, for while the fighters may have been well trained and closely matched, their weaponry was more than capable of delivering a quick killing blow. The bouts lasted about the same length of time as a modern mixed martial arts match. Between the physical exertion of trying to kill a person and the sheer energy of having thousands cheer and jeer, it seems amazing that they lasted even that long. To make things more interesting for the spectators, Roman gladiators were divided up into different classifications of fighters. Each type of fighter had different weapons and armor. As a result, this required that each fighter type learn to fight differently. Within each classification, individual gladiators were ranked based on skill, which had practical effects on gladiatorial life, as gladiators probably lived and trained almost exclusively within their class and fighter level. Classifications changed over time, but perhaps the most well-known was the retiarius, the most distinctive of these, with this class wielding a trident and net. But there were many more extremely specialized type fighters, such as gladiators who fought while riding in chariots. One particularly gruesome event, the beast hunt, was not something gladiators typically trained for or partook in, with the human victims usually being condemned criminals or prisoners of war. But were a gladiator to be trained in certain specialized schools, such as the morning school, they might find themselves on a career trajectory facing ravenous creatures in the arena, albeit better equipped to survive than the usual doomed prisoners. Mixed martial arts fans these days may compare one combatant's grappling skills against another's punching and kicking skills. Such spectator-driven matchups were similar for gladiators. Classes of gladiators were specifically paired with one another in fights in order to display the strengths and weaknesses of the other. The idea was that fights were supposed to be fair, but fighters were not to be identical. This allowed for greater audience engagement and encouraged gambling. Most pairings involved a lightly armed fighter against a heavily armed one. The retiarius, for example, would often be matched against a type of gladiator called a secutor. The retiarius, being lightly armed with a net and trident, would try to entangle the much slower and heavily armed secutor. A sturdy blow from the secutor would dispatch the netman quickly. One may imagine how in a match like this, the retiarius would constantly run away from the secutor while looking for an opportunity to toss his net over.
The net is quite slow in flight. The myrmidon would simply move out of the way.
And there were other similar matchups between lightly armored fighters and heavily armored fighters. The Romans sometimes called this the difference between small shield men and big shield men. Therefore, it was rare to see two of the same class of fighters face one another. Gladiators did not have 9-to-5 jobs. Instead, they trained for years for the infrequent appearances. The book, The Eternal City, explains that the average gladiator may have fought only 1 or 2 times a year, while the rest of the time spent training and traveling. On very rare occasions, gladiators were credited with fighting in as many as 60 matches, but it was extremely unusual for someone to fight that many times, despite how gladiators have been portrayed by Hollywood.
Joey, do you like movies about gladiators?
It seems low, but there are modern comparisons. Professional boxers, for example, only box up to 3 fights per year, with less than 24 bouts on average in an entire career. Those numbers also confirm the value of Roman gladiators as financial resources. The best among them needed to be saved and used with the greatest effect so that the most money could be made. However, there are exceptions to this infrequent trend. For example, when the Emperor Trajan held games, one gladiator fought in 9 fights over the course of 9 days. It must have been a genuinely terrifying and stressful experience for the gladiator, though it ended happily since this particular gladiator was granted freedom at the end of the ordeal. Healthcare in ancient Rome may have been primitive when compared to modern medicine, but gladiators probably had the finest medical care available for the age. This was because of their value. Even though gladiators were generally enslaved, their worth to the gladiatorial school was so much that they needed them not just to be alive, but to be killers in a peak health condition. The most well-known gladiator doctor was Galen. He was from an aristocratic family, but in 157 AD, he chose to become a physician to gladiators. It was an unusual step, especially when considering all the things connected to gladiators were considered demeaning. For Galen's purposes, though, he used the experience to learn about human anatomy and to experiment with the gladiator's diet.
Galen was such an ambitious and driven individual that he wanted to become the world's greatest doctor.
Aside from being patched up and otherwise well-tended, gladiators also had special services. For example, Roger Dunkel in Gladiators, Violence and Spectacle in Ancient Rome notes that gladiators, especially in the preeminent imperial gladiatorial schools, were serviced by masseuses who worked on the knotted muscles of fighters. This care may be why gladiators in these top schools were said to have better morale than those in other backwater burg schools. A gladiator's ostensible job was to kill or be killed, but in reality it was a very death-averse profession, as the value of gladiators as entertainment commodities and the expensive cost of training them meant that trained gladiators were far from disposable.
Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained? Is this not why you are here?
There were, naturally, several ways a gladiator could die, the most obvious being killed outright by his opponents, which is a real risk. Another way was when the editor, who was the official and sponsor of the games, ruled that the defeated gladiator could not be spared, or on occasions when the spectators demanded death. This usually happened only when the defeated gladiator didn't do his job correctly and really ticked off the audience with a bad show. When an editor ruled death, he had to pay the gladiator's manager, the lanista, the cash value of the gladiator. Therefore, there were strong financial incentives against a ruling of death, and most defeated gladiators were likely spared. It is also clear that by the imperial period, not all gladiator matches were fought to the death anyway, as a good number were instead staged demonstrations. There were 3 ways a gladiator could exit the arena. The best way was through a special door that was reserved for victors. The worst way was through a similar door that was reserved for the dead, who were hauled out and stripped of their weapons. Door number 3 was reserved for the defeated but spared gladiator who left in shame. However, there were occasions in gladiatorial combat when everybody could be a winner. One such occasion took place at the gladiatorial games sponsored by Emperor Titus in the 1st century AD. These games marked the opening of the famous Roman Colosseum. Among the notable events, which included a rare human winner and a battle versus beasts, there was an epic fight between two gladiators named Barracks and Priscus. Barracks and Priscus were equally matched and fought to a standstill. The crowd, evidently bored, started to demand a draw. Still, Emperor Titus, who was presiding, did not make a judgment, since he had established a rule that contests would continue to go on until someone yielded. Eventually, the two gladiators yielded simultaneously. Titus paid tribute to their courage by sending the two gladiators palms of victory and wooden swords, a symbol that they had been granted their freedom along with their retirement from the arena. In the Roman Colosseum, there was blood to be spilled and money to be made. In general, though, the gladiators spilled the blood and other people got the money. The Gladiators, history's most deadly sport, explains that most money went to the lanista. If cash was doled out to the fighters, it was usually some token sum and a prize wreath or olive branch. That being said, there were rare occasions when a gladiator hit the equivalent of the lottery. For example, the Emperor Tiberius doled out the modern equivalent of over $150,000 to several veteran gladiators to lure them out of retirement. The notorious Emperor Nero, a fan of the games, took a shining to one gladiator and granted him properties, which included a palace. In some cases, elite gladiators even worked out a percentage system with the lanista, where they kept a portion of the prize money. Enslaved gladiators were given 20%, while free gladiators got 25%. The rest went to the lanista. Even though gladiator fights were widely popular, there had always been moral objections to them. The Roman philosopher Seneca was disgusted by the gratuitous violence, writing of its impact on the soul, "Either you will be corrupted by the multitude, or, if you show disgust, be hated by them, so stay away." It is impossible to know what the gladiators thought, but they may have shot back that the gladiatorial combat had a religious purpose, which it did, at least in the beginning. The Etruscans deeply influenced the Romans. They made various sacrifices to the gods, sometimes to honor them and sometimes as a form of divination. As part of these rites, they held warrior combat events as a death ritual at funerals, where the combatants would be assumed to journey with their demise to the afterlife as bodyguards.
Showed the family's place in society by making a human blood offering to go with the burial.
Centuries later, virtually all the religious meaning behind the games had evaporated, except for two small reminders. First, it was common to see a person dressed as the messenger god Mercury, who sometimes struck a final blow after a gladiator had fallen. Also, at the most prestigious games, the emperor was present, who as the chief priest gave the bloodletting a divine cloak of religious authority. Gladiators had a low social status, but were still greatly admired for their strength and skill. Donald G. Kyle explains the reasoning behind their sex appeal and spectacles of death in ancient Rome. He notes that the gladiators were the ultimate form of ancient manliness, breaking taboos through the violent eroticism of the games. In other words, they were the ancient Roman equivalent of the quintessential bad boy. Roman graffiti reveals that gladiators received a lot of romantic attention, with one gladiator called the heartthrob of the girls. Other evidence has been unearthed by archaeologists, including artifacts in which images of gladiators are shown juxtaposed with erotic images. It seems that the chief object of desire may have been the Thracian class of gladiators. Their armor was more flashy and refined, which may have promulgated their reputation as sex objects. The sex appeal of gladiators is also confirmed in literature. One Roman satirist wrote how even aristocratic Roman women wanted to run away and have romantic dalliances with gladiators, and the gladiators returned the affection. One gladiator, nicknamed the Flame, was so enamored of the attention he received from the crowds that even though he was freed from enslavement 4 times, he chose each time to return to the arena. The Flame finally died at age 30 after fighting 34 times. Ancient Rome is notorious for its extravagant dining, and so it's no surprise that big games required big gladiator feasts. The night before matches, gladiators held a feast arranged by the sponsor of the games. Not only did the gladiators enjoy copious amounts of expensive food and drink, but so did beast fighters and the condemned criminals. It was basically the Roman version of a last meal before execution. One can only imagine how these 3 groups interacted, but the idea behind them was for the game's host to show how thankful he was to the people who may die in his games. They were held outside in a public area where people could interact with the participants, so it was a clever way of marketing the upcoming game. With the participants, though, there was also a lot of last-minute will-making, where arrangements were made for their wives and families. One thing that gladiators did not have to worry about in life was armor. Not only did they not have a lot of it, but what they had was provided to them by their gladiator school. Most gladiator armor consisted of leg guards and helmets, and in many cases there was no protection for the chest. Of the different classifications, the retiarius was the most poorly armored, given just a shoulder guard to go with his net trident. His usual opponent, the secutor, tended to be the most heavily armored, giving a large head-to-toe shield and armor for the sword arm. Some armor was more elaborate and was created no doubt to show off the gladiator's physique. These pieces included plumed helms complete with engravings. However, again, the armor didn't belong to the gladiator. Gladiator, the Complete Guide to Ancient Rome's Bloody Fighters, reports that the equipment all went back to the school, and elaborate pieces would have been passed from generation to generation of gladiators. This may have occurred either through retirement or, just as likely, death. Gladiators did not have a retirement plan per se, simply surviving each fight was the primary goal. Nonetheless, many gladiators managed to make it through their careers alive and eventually retire. Those who did so were given their freedom, receiving a wooden sword as a public symbol that they were no longer enslaved. Retirement marked a new phase in the gladiator's life. Some, of course, could enter into civilian life. As free agents, gladiators looking for work played to their obvious strengths. Some became bodyguards, or in the disruptive period of the late Republic, were hired as muscle for gangs. But the low social standing of a gladiator, along with his inherent experience fighting, often led retirees to stay within the profession as trainers or even the heads of gladiator schools. Due to their experience, they were often highly sought after to train new gladiators. There were even some rare few who, through prize money and aristocratic favor, could amass a small fortune. One notable example was Spiculus, favorite of the infamous Emperor Nero, whose victories in the arena landed him with wealth beyond most Romans' wildest dreams, and who met his end not in combat, but by being crushed to death by a toppled statue of Nero during a riot.